On a side note, I would like to talk about Athenian democracy. Democracy in Athens was a pillar of its existence. It is claimed to be the birthplace of democracy, and, in its time, was the bastion of democracy. Athens wasn't, however, the only democracy of its time. Democracies were scattered across the island polises of the Aegean Sea, and were seen in others from Asia Minor to the Italian peninsula. Regardless, in order to understand Athens and its actions during our period of study, it's essential to understand its government, democracy. Democracy in Athens wasn't always present. In fact, for a long period, it was ruled by an oligarchy. 7th century Athens was governed by the aristocratic class. It delegated its power into several archons, leaders, who controlled several magistrates. Another important body of this time was the Council of Elders called the Areopagus, named after the huge rock in Athens where it convened. This council consisted of ex-archons and in this sense was akin to the Roman Senate of the Republic. The oligarchy ruled only to the benefit of the aristocrats, and it was this same oligarchy that in 621 BCE enabled a man by the name of Draco to codify Athenian law and government. One of Draco's first reforms was to write down and define the then oral Athenian constitution. The point of this was to enable any literate Athenian to read and understand it, as well as to disable the ability of the Areopagus to recite the law from an oral tradition which was prone to manipulation, confusion, and wild interpretations for their abuse. Draco's reforms did extend much further, and in these reforms we see it become draconic. In fact, it was the draconic reforms. Among these was the widespread use of the death penalty for crimes big and small. For example, the punishment for theft was death. Plutarch asserts that when questioned about his liberal use of capital punishment, he answered that he considered these lesser crimes to deserve it, and he had no greater punishment for the more important ones. The Athens Draco had reformed was one of harsh rule. Citizens of the polis were prone to slavery due to another of Draco's reforms that made it that so anyone owing money to someone who was of lower class than the person they owed it to was to be enslaved. The salvation of the Athenian lower class was to come in the form of a leading archon some 30 years later, a man by the name of Solon. In 594, Solon, then a former military commander, became head archon of Athens. In his position of power, he initiated reforms of his own that would help to undermine the oligarchy's rule. Firstly, he cancelled all debts, eliminating the issue of slavery of the Athenian people. Next, in the same stride, he repealed all of the draconian laws. Solon then reclassed the people of the city in a move to open up the magistrates to the people other than the most upper class. From highest class to lowest class, it goes the Pentakasoi Medumnoi, which were the leading aristocratic class and had an annual income of 500 medimnoi. Medimnoi being about 52 liters of cereal. Next were the Hippeis, with 300 medimnoi annually, about the class of the cavalrymen, followed by the Zeugatai, valued at 200 medimnoi, the class of the clad hoplites and infantrymen. Lastly, with the peasant class of the Thetes, who had 200 or less medimnoi annually. This class made up the bulk of the Attican population, and they were the working class, farmers, and the like. Solon had also initiated a new ruling body, the Bull. It was a competing council to the Areopagus, numbering a total of 400 members elected from the upper three classes. Unlike the Areopagus, they consisted only of the Pentakasoi Medimnoi. The Bull absorbing a number of the Areopagus's power and responsibilities, such as management of the city, leaving the Areopagus with legal and court responsibilities. These reforms were considered by a number of contemporary and modern historians as the beginning of democratic reforms in the Athenian government. The Thetes, however, were still left outside of the governing of themselves. This would soon change. Soon after Solon stepped down in around 584 BCE, the new government he reformed started to show some tears. The social factionalism of before his reforms re-emerged, and it resulted in all manners of political issues, such as members not standing down from their posts to even some important posts not being filled at all. This upheaval allowed for an influential citizen to seize the reins of power, Pisistratos, and became tyrant. He managed to commit a successful coup with the backing of the Thetes, the vast and unrepresented majority. As we've talked about before, being a tyrant in Greece wasn't always meaning they ruled with an iron fist or cruelly. In fact, Pisistratos was seen as a model for the popular tyrant, led to power by the people and to the benefit of them. Pisistratos kept the laws, not enacting anything remotely draconic, and ordered the courts and governments well, keeping most of the existing consulship roles of the classes. But he did many favors for the Thetes, such as cancelling all debts, cut taxes, and creating a traveling band of judges that went to the further communities across Attica to offer fair trials. Pisistratos saw himself as the bastion of the Thetes, and largely represented their dissatisfaction. Fast forward another couple decades, and in 508 BCE, Cleisthenes had overthrown the sons of Pisistratos, who inherited his tyranny. The two brothers had vied for each other's power, leading to the assassination of the other, who ruled brutally over their citizens. With Cleisthenes in power as head archon, he was back in a position to reform Athens as Solon had done. Among Cleisthenes' biggest changes was the reorganization of Athens and Attica. He divided it into 10 demes, or regions. These demes became the basis of the organization of the region and politics. He even pushed forward a social reform to replace namings based on fathers and forefathers to those based on the demes your family inhabited. With these new demes, Cleisthenes overhauled the bowl to consist of 50 men over the age of 30 from all 10 demes and of any class, changing the total number of the bowl to 500. This new bowl also had a new oath, to advise according to the laws what was best for the people. The role of the bowl was now to propose legislation, general maintenance of the city, and to advise the assembly. The legislation proposed by the bowl wasn't passed by the bowl. That power was granted to the assembly. The assembly was a new body of the people, for the people, by the people. It consisted of all male Athenian citizens of 18 years of age. As a member, you had the right to speak, discuss, and debate on anything proposed. The current speaker would go to the bema, from which he faced the entire crowd that could have numbered in the thousands. The assembly met at a place called the Nix, one of the hills in Athens, across from the Acropolis. After each speaker spoke, the assembly then voted by a show of hand to be either for, against, or to see amendments to the legislation. This process was used for domestic and foreign relations, declarations of war, military assignments, and law. Due to its fundamental nature to the entire government process, the assembly met about 4 times a month. This was the democratic system of Athens, and this fundamental aspect of direct democracy was maintained for most of the rest of classical history. However, some features of the democracy did naturally evolve over time. For example, Cleisthenes instituted a system of demarchy, where all magistracies were elected at random by people over the age of 30 from across Attica. This radical democratic system did aid at the time to avoid the almost dynastic control of certain offices, but it also meant that people with no experience or qualifications were put into office. Eventually, this was replaced with proper elections for each office by the assembly. Of these officers, however, their position didn't give them much power to directly make decisions, as it was the assembly alone who made the final decisions. Hence, in the time of the late classical period, power rested less in the political office you held, but rather your ability to persuade. True political power were in the hands of those who were influential speakers, masters of rhetoric. Thus, upcoming politicians did not rise to power from merit, but rather how well they could convince the assembly. Due to this, they would align themselves with already influential speakers until they themselves became their own in public life. The nature of this advancement would cause bitter rivalries and betrayals amongst the influential. These were the demagogues, leaders of the people, and with these demagogues, we start to see some of the faults of Athenian democracy. Let's take a look at the assembly, a political body that at the root of everything was the final say in all matters. This was comprised of any and all citizens of Athens, skilled and unskilled, educated and uneducated. Its roles empowered the people, but left them unable to safeguard themselves from manipulation. The influential speakers of the assembly would often tell half-truths or lie outright, just to put forward their cases, and the assembly was largely unable to see through them. The results were declarations of war under false senses of advantage, to reforms that were unnecessary and detrimental. This issue of demagoguery was not unrealized by some Athenians, for they had seen the effects of it firsthand with the Italian expedition. One man in particular is noted to have questioned the fault of allowing everyone and anyone to vote: Socrates. Known as the father of Greek philosophy and among the most well-known of them, Socrates was an influential man of the early 4th century. He questioned many values of Greek and Athenian life and society, giving the basis to many philosophical quarrels today. Socrates wondered why the Athenians would place all the power in the hands of a large uneducated majority that was not qualified to make decisions on politics, warfare, and administration. In comparison, should it not be those who have studied such fields professionally and for most of their lives to make these decisions? Socrates argued that to leave it in the hands of the unqualified will lead to disaster and manipulation of the government by those influential and charismatic demagogues. To cut a long and complicated story short, Socrates was faced with the trial for corrupting the youth. He was found guilty of such, but only by a small majority, and sentenced to death. Another fault with the assembly and the general democratic process of Athens was its slow reactions. To get a motion passed to send an Athenian force somewhere, the bull would need to set the agenda and outline the extent and plans of the expedition. Next, each orator, for or against it, would be allowed to speak to argue the necessity, plan, and logistics of the force sent. Lastly, the assembly would vote on the matter to be approved, declined, or to be reworked, restarting the entire process. Now, if we take the system used by one of Athens' greatest rivals, Philip II of Macedon, we see that he was able to make decisions of deployment, organization, and plans quickly and decisively to give himself the advantage. The Athenian system would be unable to keep up, left confused at sudden changes of movement, deployment, and strategy. Philip was able to execute his manner because he held the centralized power at the helm of a monarch. Athenian democracy was a very challenging and interesting government of its age. Although it was radical, it was still the pioneer of democracy and the bastion of the ideology for centuries to come, and even now in our modern age. It could be best seen as the greatest experiment on a system thought at the time to be the most ridiculous and nonsensical. However, through its faults of manipulation and incompetency, it still managed to largely succeed for a near continuous 2 centuries. And for it, Athens has left its mark in history.